Okay, so in this video I'm going to introduce you to transcribe a MIDI to RS-232 serial utility module for performance control of older and obsolete video gear. First we will look at the different options for the inputs and outputs on the circuit, and then I will show you a few examples. Eventually I will make another video that goes into more detail on how you can edit the open source firmware and customize the mapping between MIDI and your mixer controls, but that's not in the scope of this one. So yeah, to get started, let's talk about the inputs. So MIDI is commonly sent either over USB if it's on new gear, or serial if it's on old gear. So serial MIDI is usually sent on DIN 5 cables, like this. You'll sometimes also see it sent on 3.5 millimeter jacks on newer gear. Yeah, so on the transcribe PCB there's footprints to put in either your 3.5 millimeter jack or your DIN 5 MIDI. The default will be DIN 5, but you can also get cables that have DIN 5 on one end and 3.5 millimeter on the other. This is the serial MIDI input, and next to it is the serial MIDI output, which MIDI output is not kind of used in the default configuration as a MIDI to RS-232 converter, but it is possible you might want to flash custom firmware to take use of this MIDI output. For example, if you were making a USB to serial MIDI converter or something like this. USB is a directional protocol, which means that every USB connection, one end is a host and the other end is a device. This is why you will never see USB cables with USB A type plugs on both ends. It's not possible to connect host to host or device to device. USB type A plugs are used for the USB host. So this end would go into your computer or Raspberry Pi, and USB B type plugs, like this one, as well as USB micro and mini B, like this one. All of these are used for connecting to the USB device, i.e. printers, keyboards, MIDI controllers, etc. So transcribe can act as both a USB device and a USB host, which means that all kinds of USB MIDI inputs can be used. If you want to send MIDI from a computer or a Raspberry Pi, then plug your USB type A into the computer, and the other end will be micro USB into this port here, which is going into the microcontroller on the board. And if you want to get messages from a USB device, e.g. Korg nanokontrol, for example, then plug the USB type B mini into the controller, and the other end, the USB type A, into transcribe. So now let's talk about the outputs on transcribe. So RS-232 is an old standard for sending serial commands. most commonly you'll see it being sent over a cable like this, D sub 9, where usually the send command will be on pin 3 and the receive commands will be on pin 2. However, at least some devices have these pins reversed. So on the transcribe circuit, there are little jumper pins where you can select which of these formats that will be used for the DIN9 jack on transcribe. So putting it to the left, which is the default, is to send the send commands on pin 3. The transcribe can also send RS-232 serial over 3.5 millimeter jack. This is a good compact alternative to the larger D sub 9 pins. So if you have a device that uses a non-standard port for serial, you could always modify it with the standard 3.5 millimeter jack and then use this output on transcribe to connect to your device. And finally, the power is provided to the transcribe again through the micro USB port on the Pro microcontroller part of the board. So this will already be connected if you are sending MIDI from a USB host like we discussed, but if you are not, then this can just be plugged straight into the wall with one of those USB to wall adapters, and that will power the circuit. You also could use the Eurorack header if you have extended it to carry 5 volts on it as well. Okay, so in this first example, I'm going to show you how to use my Korg nanokontroller as a USB MIDI device to send commands to this video mixer, the Panasonic AVE55, using transcribe to take MIDI and send the commands that Panasonic AVE55 expects. Serial over a 3.5 millimeter jack, so I plug that in to here, and the other end is connected to the serial input on the back of the mixer. Let's power the transcribe with this Pro Micro cable, and then we can connect the USB device by pushing this little button beneath the Pro Micro here, and you'll see this light comes on when it's connected on the controller to tell us that there's a connection. So now the way that the mixer is configured is that one source is this camcorder, which you can see me on, and the other source is just feedback, internal mixer feedback, so from the output into one of the inputs. And so just off the bat we can see that we can control the wipe between sources A and B with this slider. The first thing I can show you is moving the X and Y position of the crossfade using these two sliders. I also can put effects on either of the channels. So on channel A I can put on mosaic, paint, strobe effects, and then also on channel B the same thing, strobe and paint. I can move it around both the position and the screen grabber can be moved around using this, and also color correction. Additional to this, you can jump to different sources, pushing the buttons here. can put on a luma key. As well as this. There's also a button I've programmed to randomly set the mix position. So every time you push it, you get a different mix position. I've written down for my own reference what each of the different, the way I've mapped each of these different effects. But this is something that you can do for yourself in any way that makes sense to you when you know how to edit the firmware, because it's all open source. That example is a good way to show you one advantage of using transcribe, which is that we can expose features of the mixer which might otherwise have to be accessed via menu diving. So the Panasonic AV55 is a perfect example of this. It's actually a really capable mixer, has 4 channels, lots of effects and cool wipes, but is less popular in the performance community because it doesn't have the immediate access to these features. So whereas the MX30 and the MX50 have a knob for every or button for every effect and wipe, this one has to go into the menu to set things, which is a bit annoying way of performing. But now you can just add your own controller and access all of the effects and color corrections and everything from here. So that's one advantage of using transcribe. The next advantage I will show you involves using another piece of gear, which is the deluge, which is a sequencer and sampler and synthesizer all in one, made and designed right here in Wellington. And I want to show you how I can use this to sequence some of the effects on the Panasonic AV55. So I'm going to connect the deluge using MIDI, old style DIN MIDI. So here we can control MIDI CC using these knobs up the top. So if I hold down this knob and turn this one, I set it to control CC0, and CC0 is control over the wipe between A and B. So straight away we can access that, and then we can set some other parameters. For example, go to the next one over and put it to 2, and this will be left and right of that position, and then the next one over, I'll put it on 3, it should be up and down. Beauty of doing it with a deluge is that I can control these parameters, but also I can record that control. So if I have the deluge playing and the record button on, then any CC movement that I do in this while it plays this bar will then be automated and applied to the device the next time it comes around. So now I can automate some left and right movement. Yes, now every time I send a note, it will change the wipe pattern. And so, I mean, I'm just showing a few examples here, but you can easily see how having sequenced control over these parameters means that it's really easy to synchronize your visual performance up with your audio performance. Either if you were doing an audio performance on the deluge and you could use the same stems to trigger these MIDI notes, having the ability to sequence like you would a musical instrument gives you a lot of performance control. So yeah, whatever sequencer you're most comfortable with, as long as it can send MIDI, you can use it to control your video mixer. In this final configuration, I've got the transcribe circuit hooked up to this Extron 8x8 video switcher, so it has up to 8 inputs and 8 outputs, and I can use the deluge to send switching messages through transcribe into the switcher to sequence switching different sources. So I've only got 3 displays set up in a little TV stack here, and I've got 3 inputs going into the switcher. So the inputs are this glitch footage from a circuit bent VCR player that's off screen, and then I've got this shader source coming from the recur boy, and finally I've got camera input here, looking at the deluge. So I can push each of these buttons on the deluge, and that will switch the sources. So the cool thing about this, again, is that I can use the sequencer, and then when I run it, the switching will happen automatically there. So this is another example of how you can use transcribe to sequence video performances.